So this talk is called Private CDNs Made Easy. My name is Reza. I work for Varnish Software. We're kind of the owners of Varnish Cache. I'm one of the engineers at Varnish Software. Been working here for a few years. Been using Varnish for about 5-6 years. So this talk, we're going to kind of look into what it takes to build a CDN, but also kind of like, how people are using CDNs right now and today. Some of the talks kind of highlighted it, where we kind of have hybrid CDNs, kind of multi-CDN architectures, and then some people are actually moving towards private CDNs, DIY CDNs. So we'll kind of examine that. This is going to be a pretty brief presentation, so I'm going to try to hit a lot of different topics and kind of do a deep dive into kind of what it takes to kind of build a CDN. These days it's pretty easy. With tools like Varnish, building a CDN is actually pretty easy, pretty straightforward. Okay, so Varnish Software, who are we? So we're basically the company behind Varnish Cache. Varnish Cache is free and open source software. It's actually developed by like a team of developers. Some of them are employed by Varnish Software, some of them aren't. And then we even have like a few different kind of companies that kind of contribute. Fastly is one of them, and we have a few other kind of small organizations which contribute to kind of that open source mission. And then obviously they get some benefits in return. So Varnish Cache, this is kind of an open source reverse proxy. Caching is something it does very well. But it basically, I sometimes say it's kind of like an HTTP gateway. It does routing. You can go ahead and kind of configure rules. You can manipulate requests. You can manipulate responses. It basically kind of encompasses all sorts of things HTTP. We have something called Varnish Plus. This is kind of our enhanced proprietary version of Varnish Cache. It's kind of a little bit more geared for enterprise users, has extra features, has better support, a different release cycle. Like I said, it's kind of geared more towards the power user, the enterprise user, the CDN user. And then finally, we have something called Varnish Extend. Varnish Extend basically takes Varnish Plus, and then we even go ahead and bundle in DNS routing, and that's through one of our partners, Sodexis. And this gives you kind of this whole encompassing kind of CDN solution. So you can kind of think of it, you start with Varnish Cache, open source, very minimal core. Varnish Plus, this is kind of one step up. And then finally Varnish Extend, and this is kind of where we kind of bundle in more services. So I guess to start with kind of what are the modern CDN architectures that we're seeing today. So obviously, I didn't list this, but we kind of have mono CDN, and that's kind of where you choose a CDN, that's your CDN, it's just one, and you kind of, you pay their rates, you get their services. But a lot of times today we're seeing multi-CDN. That's kind of where you have more than one CDN. You can kind of move your content between it. Users are connecting to one or another one. Second, we have hybrid CDN, and that's kind of where you're augmenting a CDN vendor with kind of your own services. And kind of running a CDN or kind of running a POP is just as simple as just running a Varnish or running like, some sort of HTTP-based caching solution. And then finally, we have DIY CDN, and that's kind of where you actually build out a caching presence. You kind of build it out for, kind of geared towards actually serving out some sort of capacity. Not just say, hey, we're going to offload maybe 5 or 10% traffic. You actually kind of build it out. There might be some strategic reason you want to do that, whether that's to kind of have a better control of your security, better control of your delivery. Maybe you just have a lot of really custom logic, or maybe even just to kind of cut costs, or just to kind of beef up your offerings. Lots and lots of reasons why people are building CDNs today. I would say one of the big ones is for security and for kind of control of content. So what are the components? So like I mentioned before, Varnish Cache or Varnish Plus, that kind of takes care of your caching, your routing, like basic everything that has to do with that request hitting the server and then actually giving a response. We partner with Sidexis, and that kind of takes care of routing. And in all those different scenarios of having, like, let's say, a multi-CDN or a hybrid CDN, Sidexis kind of takes care of, like, how do we actually make that decision where that request goes. Does this request go to, like, CDN X, Y, does it go to origin? What do we do there? And Sidexis does that. That routing is done at the DNS level. It could be geo-based, so geographically based. There's something called RUM, which is real user metrics. So that's kind of saying, like, hey, what's the performance that we're seeing out in the field, for this particular region or this particular network. Or it could be just like programmable, meaning you can just kind of code up, or you can kind of put your own logic to kind of make that decision. That decision can be based on the time of day, be based on some sort of metrics like cost, location. It's really up to you to define, like, how we want to go ahead and route that request. So we'll start with a multi-CDN. This is pretty basic. So we just have kind of two CDN vendors. If you look here, we can see that before we even hit a CDN, we kind of go through that Sidexis layer. And the key here is that we're behind the CDNs, we're running Varnish. What that does is that gives you the ability to kind of normalize your content, and not even just normalize the content, but just kind of normalize the behavior and kind of what you're seeing come out of the CDN. Because some CDNs may need headers in one format, like Akamai uses edge control. You may see another CDN need something else. What we can do is we can kind of put all those rules inside of Varnish. And then that way, when you do have like a CDN, and let's say the CDN has really competitive pricing, or let's say the CDN has really good coverage in South America, but their API may have a few quirks, maybe invalidating, you have to jump through some hoops. What we can do is we can go ahead and kind of encapsulate that logic in our origin, in that kind of Varnish layer right there. And then that way your backend doesn't have to kind of worry about, like, okay, I now want to integrate with this CDN. We kind of let Varnish kind of handle delivering content to all CDNs. So what are like the pros and cons? So obviously you're going to have much lower costs than the mono CDN. And that's something that's kind of obvious. It's something that you'll probably hear from Dan the next presentation, is that when you kind of bring multiple CDNs to the table, you kind of get that extra negotiating power. You'll see your costs go down. Sometimes they may, kind of counter that by giving you like minimum, like, you have to kind of have a minimum amount of traffic, but that's all kind of specific to how you negotiate that contract. But in general, bringing multiple CDNs to the table just means lower cost. Higher levels of performance. So if you are using something like Sidexis, you can basically choose the CDN like on request, you can choose the best performing CDN request by request. So you can just make sure that every request is getting the optimal route. And finally, global scale. Between probably having 2 or 3 CDNs, you can probably cover 95% of the population out there. So the next step here would be something like a hybrid CDN. So this is kind of the same as kind of what we saw in the previous diagram, except that we kind of have Varnish here acting as kind of a point of presence. I kind of have it split up in that we have like a separate kind of Varnish cluster for origin, and then a separate one as kind of our edge, but that could have just been one. We could just have like, Varnish, and it could kind of be both. It could be both our origin, and it can also just serve traffic directly. And the reason this is possible is because, running Varnish is this is very comparable to kind of the software that CDNs are running. There's nothing that you're not going to have, and you actually possibly even get better performance. You get more control. You have the ability to kind of put the logic into Varnish as you see fit. So one of the key things here is that kind of doing a hybrid CDN, especially if you're doing that with kind of with like a service like Sidexis, is that there's very, very low risk. So if you were to go ahead and say like, hey, I want to kind of offset 10, 20, 30% of my traffic to my own network, that's not like an all or nothing decision. You could do that, today, and then you could look at the performance, be like, no, maybe that wasn't a good idea. And then tomorrow you go ahead and route the traffic to, the other CDNs. So this is something where you can kind of get your feet wet, get your toes wet, deploy a few servers out there, put some traffic on those servers, and just see what the results are. Generally, what you're going to see is that you're going to see much lower costs, because when you kind of offload traffic to your own network, you're not paying per gig. You're paying fixed costs, and those costs are generally, per month. You lease a line, you buy some hardware, you might have to get some data center or co-location space, but those costs are significantly lower than what you would be paying if you're paying per gigabyte, to a CDN. And then also you do have the opportunity to even get equal or better performance than what you would be getting on a CDN. That's because, you could be on the same network. A lot of times your hardware could be on the same network that CDNs are using. Your hardware is actually dedicated to your traffic. You're not sharing this with, hundreds or thousands of other clients. And like I said, the software that you're running, Varnish, extremely high performance. This is equal or maybe higher performance than what the CDNs are running. So finally, I kind of have a little diagram here, and that's kind of what a DIY, do-it-yourself CDN would look like. And here I kind of, there's lots of different kind of architectures or configurations. And this one, we kind of made it so it's kind of a little bit more optimized for video delivery. So if you look here, we have kind of 2 tiers. And this is basically just a single location, a single POP, 6 servers. So what we do is, so this could just be like, let's say you have access to a 100 gig line. We go ahead and split that up into 8 10 gig ports. We go ahead and put 2 10 gigs into each server, and that gives us about 80 gigs of capacity. 80 gigs of capacity is probably good for 40, 50, 60,000 concurrent video streams. That could be a lot of streams. It could be a little, depending on who you are. We kind of have this split up into kind of 2 tiers. We kind of have an edge tier. Edge tier is going to be memory only. And then behind the edge tier, we're going to go ahead and have kind of like a larger storage tier. So, we may have, let's say, 256 gigs of memory on each edge tier, which is going to be for, and for video streaming, that's a lot. It's a lot of live streams and VOD. Then the storage tier, we could have, like, let's say a few terabytes of storage there. Some interesting things here is, for example, we have prefetch. So what we do with prefetch is, so if you are streaming video content, like I said, this is very optimized for video. We're going to go ahead and prefetch those fragments onto the edge tier. So what's going to happen is, like, when you DNS into the edge, you're going to basically pin yourself to a server. And then what we can do is we can go ahead and, as you're streaming that video, whether that's live or on demand, we can go ahead and kind of prefetch all those fragments there. So that way your entire video streaming session, you're basically getting, pretty much like 95% cache hits on that server. You're not kind of falling through back to that second tier or even origin. Because, let's say you're watching some video that no one else has seen, we can still make sure that that video is available on your edge. So what are the pros and cons here? So obviously pros, fixed costs, purchasing hardware, leasing lines, co-locating space, that's going to cost you, some sort of fixed amount of cost. Like, let's say maybe like that diagram in the previous slide, maybe that's going to cost you like, $3,000, $4,000, $5,000 a month. Yeah, if you were to go ahead and pay for that to CDN, that could be tens of thousands of dollars a month. And that's the thing, that fixed cost basically gives you a certain amount of capacity. Whereas, like, if your traffic fluctuates, you could be paying even a lot more. You have total content security. You kind of own the hardware. You own the software. you have basically total control over all that data flowing through the servers. Like I said, you control the software, so you have all control over kind of what are the, what we say in Varnish, like what that VCL configuration is, how you kind of format the data, how you deliver it to the clients. Another nice thing here is, like, once again, this blends really well with kind of like a hybrid architecture. So like I was saying before, one of the nice things about hybrid architecture, very low risk. So even if you were to build something like this out, and let's say that POP gets, flooded with traffic, it's not all or nothing. We can go ahead and route traffic dynamically to another location. You can scale it up or down as you see fit. You can do that day by day. Okay, so some of the components that I just kind of showed you guys. So we have Varnish Cache Plus. That's kind of like the caching engine. We have a component called Massive Storage Engine, and what that does is that basically allows you to kind of move your cache to disk. That's something that's not available in open source. So if you are caching in memory, you're going to be limited to whatever memory you have available on the server. It could be tens of gigs, could be hundreds of gigs. But obviously, if you were able to store your cache on disk, we're now talking about terabytes, tens of terabytes, even hundreds of terabytes of storage. We have another component there called Varnish High Availability. What that does is that kind of distributes cache across multiple Varnish instances. So that's a good strategy that if you want to, let's say you have multiple instances in a single data center, or let's say you have multiple instances kind of geographically dispersed, we can use VHA to kind of move cache around all those instances. So that way, when one server gets an object, we can go ahead and distribute that to a lot of other servers. What that means is that you're going to get a higher hit rate. It also means you're going to see significantly less traffic to origin. We have a lot of different tools for administration and monitoring. So you can go ahead and kind of monitor the cluster. You can monitor all these servers. You can go ahead and make changes, kind of get health checks, dashboards, and then even go ahead and analyze the traffic. And then finally, Sidexis, we're using that to go ahead and do the routing. Okay, like I said, this was a quick presentation. Does anyone, I guess we have 2-3 minutes. So does anyone here have questions? Yes?
So I think the DY do-yourself CDNs are quite interesting. I think Dan was talking about how actually most of the growth comes from private CDNs, and some of them are the sort. How Varnish compares to other solutions in the space? I think the reference publicly announced solutions were being used. I think people use ATS.
Mm-hmm.
What others are there? How is it there in terms of fit, adoption, maturity?
Yeah, I mean, there are some other kind of, so I guess I'll look at open source solutions. So there are some other open source solutions. ATS does get mentioned here and there. I think and that's Apache traffic server. I think the population of people using ATS is actually pretty small, but then the people using them may be pretty big. I guess Yahoo uses them. Honestly, I don't have too much experience with them, but I can tell you that Varnish is extremely actively developed. I think we're on kind of like I know on the open source side, we're on kind of like a biannual release schedule. So, I think every release we have, big, like a laundry list of features and enhancements. So, obviously I work for Varnish, but I would say that we're not too concerned about competition from kind of other products, because we have our own roadmap that's filled with kind of innovative features. But when it comes to just core features like caching and performance, yeah, I mean I don't know how they compare with us, but I know that Varnish is pretty good. Any other questions? Okay, thank you.